Okay, guys, I'm going to go over retrieving and forgetting. This is going to be what we're covering in class on Tuesday, the 12th, if you're B day, and then Wednesday, the 13th, if you're A day. Your warm up for today, just to make sure you're staying on top of everything, right, is doing the storing multiple choice questions that are in AP Classroom. That way you can kind of go over what we did the last class. So looking at how we encode, how we store information. All right, so if we look at forgetting, okay, this is what happens when you have information in your memory, but you just either can't get it out or you have some kind of encoding failure and it never actually really gets into your memory in the first place. So let's go look at a couple things real quick. When you forget, there's could typically be an encoding failure. I'll come back to amnesia in a second. So what an encoding failure is, it's when information doesn't go from your short-term to your long-term memory. Okay, you have trouble encoding it. You didn't provide enough meaning for the information, so you don't ever really process it. So if you're learning something, you're like, oh, we just went over that yesterday. Why don't I remember it? Well, you didn't assign enough meaning to it. There wasn't enough processing of the information, so that tends to be why you forget it. So that's what encoding failure is. Then you also have storage decay. And what that is, that's a gradual disappearance of a memory or of any kind of information because it hasn't been thought about in a really long time. So if there's something that you learned in elementary school and you knew it, like you could identify the types of rocks, like is it igneous, sedimentary, metamorphic, the different types of clouds, right? You knew the layers of the atmosphere, like stuff like that, that that it's in your memory somewhere, but because it hasn't been thought about, it eventually disappears, like from the fact that you're not able to retrieve the information anymore. So like the pathways for you to retrieve that information, that gets lost. Okay. You also have retrieval failure. So think of this as you have the memory, but your retrieval clue that you assign to it, it's not strong enough to help trigger the memory. You can also see retrieval failure with what's called tip of the tongue phenomenon. That's when you know it. Like if a teacher asks you a question and you know it and it's there and you can't think of it, but you can see it and you know the answer. That's tip of the tongue. So a lot of times you'll see teachers try to give you clues or cues to help you remember, like, okay, it starts with this letter, it rhymes with that, stuff to try to get you to jog your memory so that you can actually remember the information. But when you can't, that's a retrieval failure. Okay. You also have missing cues where your brain doesn't make the association between the information and the retrieval cue. Okay. Going back to encoding failure, that's something that ends up happening over time. I'm sorry, not encoding failure. Sorry. Storage decay. Okay. So with storage decay, right, as you forget over time, there was a psychologist by the name of Ebbinghausen that you need to know. And I'm trying to make sure what his first name was because I don't remember what his first name is. Hold on. See, that's what I thought, but my retrieval clue was not good enough to remember his first name. Okay. So Hermann Ebbinghausen, who came up with this concept of a forgetting curve. And it's basically how you gradually lose information over time. So it's the exponential loss of information shortly after you learn something. Okay. So after you learn something, um, immediately your forgetting curve is really, really steep. So you start to lose information very, very, very quickly. Then eventually it is going to kind of level off. Okay. So let's say that you learn a list, okay, of words. Within the first day, um, the percentage of information that you remember is going to drop anywhere from like 30 to 40%. And then eventually it'll go down to, 20%, then 10%. And then you may remember one or two words. And then that's over the course of like a month. But the percentage drop off is very, very steep at the beginning. Okay, so let's go to amnesia. Okay, so we have two types of amnesia. There's anterograde and retrograde. So anterograde or anterograde amnesia, this is where you can't form new memories. Okay, your hippocampus has been damaged and you can remember everything that happened before your brain was damaged, but you can't create new memories. So if you've seen the movie 50 First Dates with Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler, this is what she has. She had brain damage and couldn't remember anything new that had happened to her. Okay, retrograde amnesia. This is the amnesia that's pretty much temporary, where you can't recall past memories. This is like the basis for pretty much like any good spy movie, like the Bourne movies, where you wake up, you don't remember who you are, you don't know what happened, but you have all these skills because you can't remember anything that happened to you in the past. But like I said, it is temporary. And as your brain heals, it's not a permanent damage. Your memories do start to come back. Okay, there's also repression and suppression. Okay, repression is unconscious. This is where you push your thoughts out of your awareness. So, like when you repress some traumatic event that you just don't want to think about anymore. So, that's like unconsciously done by your brain. Then you have suppression, where you deliberately try to forget something. So, if something bad happened and you try to forget it, you tend to deliberately try to do other things to keep your brain busy. You go do stuff, you read, you clean, you're constantly moving and doing something so that you don't have to remember this information that you're trying to forget. Okay. Now we come to interference. All right, so what interference is, this is where you are trying to either store or retrieve information, but it is impaired by other information. Okay, so it's like static. You're trying to remember something, but something gets in the way and you don't remember it the way you're supposed to. Okay, so you have proactive interference and retroactive interference. So let me help you with what these two are. So with proactive interference, this is where previous information interferes with you trying to remember new information. So old information gets in the way of remembering new stuff. Retroactive interference is where new information interferes with trying to remember old information. So new gets in the way of old. So ways we can remember this, okay? Proactive is new. You can't remember your new locker combination because you still sit there and, try to dial in the old one, okay? So proactive is new, okay? You're trying to remember the new information. Retroactive, it's retro, right? It's old, it's cool. You're trying to remember old information. Like you can't remember your old schedule from, 6th grade because the new one is interfering. So I think the easiest way to help differentiate the two is what you're trying to remember. So proactive is you're trying to remember the new, retro is you're trying to remember the old, but then other stuff gets in the way and you can't. All right, so let's talk about memory construction errors. And so your brain can make false memories. So like kind of what we've already looked at with perception, how your brain is very susceptible to different things. This also happens when it's constructing memories, and there can be errors, okay? Like if we use the analogy of your brain as a computer, you can end up with like file errors when you're trying to encode and store this information. All right, so what misinformation is. This is where you have misleading or new information that has distorted your memory of an event. Okay, one of the people who's done a lot of work with this and who you really need to associate with this is Elizabeth Loftus. And I do have a video down here. Both of these videos deal with her, and so they're both worth watching. So she gave an example that her mother had died when she was very young. So she remembers her mother's death. But what ends up happening is she had some misleading information that like caused her to remember the information differently. So she was 14 when her mother drowned. 30 years later, she was told by her uncle that she was the one who found her mother. So now her memory of this event, that's what she remembers. She can, like if she were to tell the story of this event, she would say, well, when I was 14, my mother died. I'm the one who found her in the pool. And she had vivid recollections of finding her mother in the pool. Well, later on, through the course of talking to her uncle who had told her this information in the first place, he told her that, he was mistaken, that it was actually her aunt that had found her mother. But her brain had already constructed what comes to be known as a false memory. Okay, so false memories feel like real memories, okay? But they're not. It's just kind of how your brain puts things together. So another example of a false memory is you can recall a childhood experience, right? You tell it over and over and over again. There's stuff you might not remember, but logically you can kind of fill in the gaps. And then after several retellings, all of those details that you kind of just constructed because it made sense seem really, really real. I can give you all an example from my life. When I was probably 2 or 3, we were at the Galleria Mall in Houston, and they have an ice rink down there. And we were up on the 2nd floor. And so like they have the guard railings, right? But you can like look over the edge and see the ice skaters and stuff. Well, I stuck my head through the rails so I could see the ice skaters. Okay. And I got my head stuck. I have been told this story so much that I can actually like vividly recall this information, like this happening, even though I was 2. Like I can see me with, like my head stuck in these rails. I am pretty sure I don't remember any of this, but through the telling of this, now it has become this memory for me that I probably have no conscious awareness of, but through the retelling of all of this, it's become a false memory. Years ago, how many years ago was this? Oh, in 2015, NBC News nightly news anchor Brian Williams was over in the Middle East covering all the stuff that was going on. And he had told a story about traveling with a military helicopter, and that the helicopter he was in was hit by an RPG or rocket propelled grenade. And they had to like make an emergency landing. and all this stuff, but the event never happened the way he described it. I mean, yes, there were RPGs going off in the area and they did go land the helicopter, but not because it was hit by an RPG. When this happened, I mean, there was this big fallout. Everyone called him a liar, like he was just doing it to get attention. And then a bunch of psychologists and memory experts came out and said that, I mean, it was a false memory. And that what people don't realize is that with false memories, they can happen and you can be extremely confident that it did happen. So more than likely, he wasn't making it up for attention. It was just the way his brain processed everything and kind of just filled in the gaps and created this false memory for him. Okay, you can also have what's called source amnesia, where it's basically a faulty memory on how the information was learned. Like you can remember the substance of something, but not the source. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Okay, so you can't remember the source of the memory. Okay, but you do actually remember the memory itself. Okay, this is also called source misattribution. So again, a lot of it kind of has to go back to creating false memories and that kind of thing. Also related to all of this is the concept of eyewitness recall. And this is people who witnessed an event, whether or not what they remember is what actually happened. And so all of these end up tying together. So like if you have an episodic memory of a crime, like you saw something happen, you saw a car crash, and you think you can describe it in great detail, typically what ends up happening is people see different things based on their experiences. You can also be primed, and we talked about that before, about to help go through and reconstruct memories. Like if you can just say, well, like the cars hit each other or the cars crashed into each other, depending on the vocabulary used, it's going to elicit a different response from the eyewitness. Kind of like when we talked about surveys, you have to be very careful of the wording you use and stuff like that. You can have people who testify in court and they 100% believe what they're saying. They're not trying to lie, but just what they saw and their testimony just happens to be inaccurate. In the 80s, there was a lot of attention in legal cases about false memory and eyewitness recall and again, this kind of also ties into source amnesia. But people were going to court and testifying about things that had happened because they had all these repressed memories that they had forgotten, and they were brought back during therapy sessions. Well, comes out that the therapist was actually giving them leading questions, and it ended up with them constructing all of these false memories that they were pretty sure had happened, and they went to court and testified that they were 100% true, and this is what they remembered. So that's the thing with memories. Your brain can kind of twist stuff around, and what you think is true and what you think actually happened, it may not have happened the way that you remember it. Okay, so go watch this Brain Games video about like eyewitness recall. And then this is a TED Talk from Elizabeth Loftus where she goes and talks about all of this. Go watch these. These are really good videos, and they're really good to help explain like the problems and the errors that happen when you go and construct memories.